lulls always go to our questions that we have, I think, Sean. But
Yeah.
let's see who is up first. I saw that Jean-Paul had a question, but I don't see a hand anymore. So, anyone else have burning questions they want
Oh,
to
John,
ask?
there's John Paul.
Okay, excellent.
Yes, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Yes, I'm Jean-Paul from Democratic Republic of Congo. I'm happy to join you guys this evening. In my side is around 7 p.m.
Well,
in the
good
night.
evening.
Yes, I don't know if I will be able to finish all meeting.
Please go, please eat, please, relax a bit on a Sunday night before everything starts again on Monday.
Thank you.
So I guess we do have a question here. Ooh, this is a great question. Does the UNFCCC have an INC?
It did for the when it was created, and then it did for the Paris Agreement in the sense that um the Conference of the Parties itself functioned as the INC. Typically you see an INC convened only when you have an entirely new treaty regime being created. So typically, oh dear God, there I am on the big screen. Uh, typically you will see that we have the Paris Agreement or the Kyoto Protocol or anything that's inside a a treaty organization, a treaty body. So in other examples, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the protocols, Nagoya and in Cartagena, and some of the others, Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm have various amendments and things like that. Those are all negotiated by the Conference of the Parties once it has been created. But to get to the Conference of the Parties, you have to have an INC process so that you can then create the treaty that creates the COP and allows it to move forward. So yes, once upon a time in the years before 1992, there was an INC, but now we have shifted over to the COPs for UNFCCC and other treaty regimes that exist. But it's a great question. And it's confusing, I know, because there are so many acronyms and everything kind of comes together at once.
I guess one question to add to all that, and then I see more wonderful questions in the chat. It's not like called the INC Paris process, right?
No. Oh no, it was called the INC, well, it was called the negotiation process during the COPs for an amendment to or additional agreement to the UNFCCC, and then it was named the Paris Agreement because it was adopted in Paris. Um, there is a very big discussion and controversy now in the plastics treaty context, many things, but one thing is what the actual title will be. And then, will it be named after a city? Will it be named after Geneva? Will it be named after wherever the diplomatic conference is? Or will it just be called the Global Plastics Treaty? We don't know. Yeah.
It's amazing. Geneva is very much, Switzerland has been very much pushing to have it because they I know they've been influential in this process. Um,
Yes.
and so it's kind of getting down to the point where we're now starting to talk about naming rights. And that means strategically having it in a place that it could be impacted, we could get to conclusion.
Exactly. And and typically, I think I mentioned this last time, typically the practice is that we name the treaty after the place where it's concluded. Um, that may not always be fair, right? Maybe we should name it after the first INC host location because that's where it begins, or the middle point where something really important happened. But the tradition, the practice is this, and as a result, you do see a lot of lobbying to host these types of events because they give visibility, right? They give credibility in a way. Everyone talks about the Paris Agreement. It reminds people of Paris. And it also gives Paris a different claim and different kind of standing in international law. So that's why naming rights are so important.
Here's another great question. All these are really great questions. I should stop saying that because they all are.
I
Um,
know.
how could you explain the US politically hinders climate action through US institutions such as universities and research centers are world leading on climate science? I mean, I think that certainly could play a role into negotiations as well.
Oh, absolutely. And the unfortunate thing is that we have to think about the universities and the research centers and everything as separate entities. Now, sometimes this can be very good. For example, where they are accredited, as most of them are, certainly through the UNEP processes, so they can come and they can speak on their own as stakeholders and observers. Unfortunately, the national positions are not really synced always to this type of knowledge. So it's much more of a political and government decision at the time. And this will change, right? So in the context of the US, what we saw, for example, in the plastics treaty negotiations, but I know this was the case in other conferences of the parties as well. Um, there was a much kind of stronger movement to be very active until the November 2024 election results. And the indication, I know, Shell, I know.
We worked
And
so hard on that.
the indication that the regime, the government would change, then led to a position during INC5 where the US was much quieter. It was much more of a passive actor. It tended to come in as kind of the elder statesman in the room when there were discussions or squabbles about points that could be relatively quickly clarified. But there was a feeling amongst many people that the US would not be that active because the administration they were representing was leaving, and because whatever was decided by this or approved by this iteration of government, if we had an actual treaty draft that was approved or voted on or anything like that, would not necessarily be something that would be followed up by in the next administration. So it was a very awkward position. And the unfortunate reality is that being the host country, and this is true universally, it's not only in the US, but being the host country or home country to brilliant scientists and universities and experts doesn't kind of cross necessarily into the political world, and which is that what we see in the negotiations context. But it's an excellent question, really.
I should mention, I think it's okay to mention if there's anything I've learned from the US negotiators is that their personal opinions is very different from what they negotiate, at least from what I've seen.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the case with many negotiators.
Yeah.
It's not only US delegation, it's many negotiators because many of them are international experts, international law experts, or actually many more domestic law experts. But the majority of them are doing this because their role is something connected to environment. Sometimes they're connected to trade, sometimes they're connected to foreign ministries, etc. But even in those contexts, these are MEAs, and typically there's a separate office or subunit that will handle that. So as individuals, many people are very vested in the idea of environmental law, environmental governance, etc. The problem is, however, they have to do their jobs, and their jobs often involve them taking positions that they might not love or might not be supportive of because they represent their government and not their own views. So that's why, again, to get back to a question that was asked, I think like a week or two ago, about why it's important to have in-person negotiations and everything else. It's so important because you can also then come to know the individuals who are negotiating, and to know, even if they do have to obviously, hold the line and follow the line of their countries, to know them personally and to know where they might be able to be supportive of other things, other views, or listen to other views, or where they may have latitude. And you find that out by talking to them in the hallway, by being in an elevator with them, or waiting in line for coffee, all of these things. So that's why that human element is really so important.
And I think one quick thing worth mentioning is that there's a lot of negotiators who are not representing the United States that are US educated. One
Oh,
being
yes.
Juan Carlos of Panama, who's kind of emerged with the Panama
Yeah.
delegation, who has emerged as one of the key players in the negotiations. and as well as Mexico.
Yeah.
So the influence of US institutions is very much beyond the United States as well within these
Oh, it is.
negotiations.
No, and that's an excellent point. It is. It really is. And that's where you can see sometimes a disconnect between the political views at any point of a government and their educational institutions and what they teach and how they shape arguments that come from all over the world afterwards.
Awesome. Awesome. So next question, and Addie, do you have a specific question about the waste trade, or would you be able to elaborate more about
Yeah,
the
I would
waste
love to
trade?
hear more.
Just can you like tell me the legislation surrounding the waste trade? This is something that I've been obsessed with for a while now. Yeah, it's not a very clear question. I'm sorry.
No, but it's a great question.
No.
Important question.
And I think a prime example of what really opened my eyes personally to a lot of youth is when we went to Inc. 3 in Nairobi, is we literally saw the waste trade happening
Yeah.
45 minutes away. And I think
Oh,
someone
yeah.
from the global north, and personally I've been a big push of wanting to see the negotiations happening in the global south because of the waste trade. In fact, there were some youth delegates who were coming from, I think I could say it because it's out there, Denmark youth delegates, and I said to them, you need to go to Canberra, where literally the global north waste is being dumped into the landfills, and then there's the slum, and like see it in your own eyes. And I think it's not something to be assessed about. It's such a big topic. But Alex, go ahead.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think it depends by country. It depends on what the country legislation is. And so right now that's where we look. And it also depends on if we're looking at waste in terms of waste on land or if we're talking about transportation and management of waste at sea. Because right now we already have a number of treaties relating to certainly marine practices through the International Maritime Organization. We do have some elements of waste, depending again on the type of waste, that are covered by Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm. But there is a very big gap. If we're talking about plastics, there's obviously a very big gap in the international law realm. So that's why so many of us think it is really critical that we have it in the treaty context. But if you want to look at specific things about like it's a specific country or region, email me. Again, I'm going to put my email in the chat. Email me or WhatsApp me, and we can talk more about the specific region and and figure out what your questions are because it's a fascinating topic. It's a fascinating topic. I'm sitting here surrounded by books that are increasingly about like chemicals management and waste management. So yeah, I am happy to talk about it anytime.
There's
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Of
there's
course.
also a child. There's one of, and this is a whole topic within itself. I can share the link. There's a child, her name is Nina. She actually she might be turning 18. She's at least 17 now, but she's one of four children who have been allowed in the INC process, and her whole platform is on the waste trade.
Yeah.
She represents a community of 5 million people in Indonesia who they could barely handle their own waste, let alone all the waste that's dumped from the global north into their community. So I will
I love
also
that.
Hmm.
I will send I'll post her name in there. She's amazing. I must say the children are like celebrities in the
Oh, they
INC
are.
process since there's only four of them that have ever been allowed. They're technically not allowed.
No, and it's an interesting way that they're there in the sense that
Very much.
when we see typically, and I know Shelley and I have talked about this before, when we see children or we have seen children, particularly so youth, but really when we think more of younger children, those under 18, for example, at the UNFCCC COPs, et cetera, we think of them, they have maybe a march or a protest, but we think of them more in the sense of talking to a lot of the delegates. They look at them like, their nieces, their nephews, their grandchildren, their children. They don't necessarily occupy the same place, or at least they didn't in the beginning of authority. and of kind of commanding respect. But the children, the few that there are who are involved in the INC process, have been really well received and have had a very different presence. Their presence is very fact oriented, it's very policy oriented, and much more kind of integrated into the process than protesting against it. So it's been a very interesting way of having you present, in addition to CYMG and people like Sheldon who give brilliant interventions.
Thank you. I will also share, I hope my internet's okay. I will also share two others that we work with very closely. In fact, they're leading the subsidies webinar, which is amazing. Zara and Ashton of Hidden
Yeah.
Plastics as
Oh,
well.
please do. They're fantastic. They're wonderful.
And so is their mom. I know they're not here, but they've been following our sessions as well, and they're also amazing to look at. So we could talk about the children all day. I mean, it's fun to watch them at the INC run around, and like people were like, can I take a picture with you? Like they have more of a social life than we do at the INC because everyone just like looks up to them as individuals.
Oh, they do.
Okay.
And I think it also reminds a lot of people, like, of hope, of first of all, of what you're doing and why you're doing it, right? Because we are all kind of realizing that my age generation certainly will not be as affected by plastics as yours will, as those who are very young will, etc. But it is really, A, it's important to hear that from them, but then B, it's also just important to have their optimism and their hope.
Okay.
It really is. It's so refreshing, it just honestly is.
One last thing, and I just have to kind of shout them out. Zara and Ashton are actually working with the Maldives government right now to basically try to eliminate plastic bottles in tourism. So if you go to the droplet on their website, yeah. Okay, enough about these amazing children. We could talk all day about them though. Next question here.
But I think that is a good segue, Shellen. I think that is a good segue just to mention that I can't believe it, but next week is our final week, which will make me very sad, and we'll have to find ways to do like continuous, I don't know, updates or just like get together. We'll have to find some way to do something. But you are doing a webinar series, or there is a youth webinar series, and certainly Zara and Ashton are hosting one. I know this because I'm speaking on it. But
Alex
there
will be
are
there.
other. I will be there. I know where I'll be in May on the 16th. Anyway.
Well, I think it's also worth mentioning, and it wasn't brought to my attention until last night, even though I'm chairing all this, and I don't say that. Not a lot of people know. It's still a role I'm getting used to. We literally start consultations for the chair's tech on the 26th of April. Like we are
Yes, we
going
do.
full blown into the next steps of getting ready for INC 5.2.
We do. So there will be a lot more to update, and obviously we will talk internally about how to kind of keep this discussion going. But honestly, I know sometimes people say this, but I do truly mean it. Each and every one of you, I want you to know, you can always get in touch. Please stay in touch. I think it's really important that we maintain all of these networks.
Definitely. So this is another great question. After the boot camp will be over, what are our chances to join UNEP or the Plastics Treaty events? Do you want to answer that? Do you want me to answer that?
So I can give a generic answer, which is that, still in order to join it, you have to be affiliated with an organization that is going to be present or authorized to be present. So has an affiliation and accreditation through the UN General Assembly or UN Environment Assembly or one of the other organizations. Or there's also the option of talking to people like Shellen and CYMG. So I think that's a good way to segue to you.
Yeah, there's different ways to get involved. I would say the biggest hurdle is funding for everybody, except maybe the fossil fuel lobbyists. That's that's recorded. Oh well. And so I would say, yeah, the biggest hurdle for anybody is funding. There is a lot of different avenues to get involved through the women's major group, through different, there's 9 different major groups, as well as there's also different like groups within the major groups. But that's kind of the big answer I could give you. And we have a lot of affiliation with organizations that we represent as well within the negotiations. Okay.
And the other thing,
Go ahead.
the other thing that if you can't actually attend, there are many of us who are there, or, tweet, etc., or use other Blue Sky, whatever one uses. So share the information on what's going on that way. And then also there is, not to give a shameless plug for anyone, but it's a really important, I think, update source. The IISD produces the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, the ENB, which does on a daily basis during negotiations, and then on the weekends also as a wrap up, they will do a newsletter of what is going on in not only the plastics context, but all environmentally related treaty negotiations, conferences of the parties, intersessional meetings, etc. So it's a really good way for you to find news and find information about what's going on, even when you might not be able to go and be in the room.
Definitely, definitely. So next question, and I see Albert, you have your hand raised, but we'll try to get a few and then have them since there's so many in the chat. What communication strategies have worked best in mobilizing public support for MEAs? Another great question.
That is such a great question. Yeah, I think it depends on the MEA, and it depends on the topic that's being regulated. Climate is probably the biggest example, in the sense that we've had so many different types of protests and marches and calls for awareness, etc. So I think that is a really important element to it. But there is an argument as to how much has actually moved forward in the climate context, obviously, and we see COPs every year being a bit deadlocked. I think what we've seen, certainly in the context of the CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity, is a great deal more of the Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities being present, and also having very strong communication plans, very strong outreach plans to provide information on their viewpoints and their experiences and their understandings. And that has been very successful in transferring over into language of protocols, into language such as in the global biodiversity framework, etc. So that, I think, is something to pay attention to. They are also obviously quite active in the plastics treaty now. And one of the moments of greatest drama, but I mean this in the most kind of respectful and appreciative way, actually was during INC 5, around the midway point, when it was clear that things were going a bit off the rails in terms of being able to finish by the end of the negotiations with the treaty, where there was an effort from several Indigenous community leaders to speak, and they were actually not granted the floor for a very long time. And it was a really polarizing moment, and then obviously led to a communication strategy that really highlighted that element of needing to include those voices. And there are certain countries, many of the PCIDs, New Zealand, Canada, etc., that are very active in promoting the voices of Indigenous communities and First Nations. So that fed into a lot of government plans as well.
And we're actually seeing that communication strategy still in the lead up to 5.2. Okay. That's been it's still very much in. We have not forgotten, which we should not forget, because it impacts all of the rights holders and stakeholders.
Exactly.
Next question. So I see there's a BRS and there's one that's been answered. So I think we'll try to give, but also I know you're from Myanmar, so my condolences. I think there was a really great answer to that. But Ahmed asked, how are the historical agreements / treaties / weighed in international law and by the ICJ, given they were signed during colonialism?
It depends on which historical agreements we're talking about, but if generally the way that there's a rule, what we call intertemporal law, and the rule of contemporaneity, which is a very difficult word to say, I must point that out. But in international law, we have these as interpretive rules. And what they mean is that when we are deciding a case, whether it is at the national level deciding an international claim, a court case, or whether it's the ICJ, we look at the law applicable at the time, the valid law at the time. Now, it might be something we don't agree with now. Clearly, colonial agreements, etc., are not things that we would typically agree with today as a matter of law. But at the time, they were valid. And at the time, the legal system that was functioning regarded them as valid. And that is the only thing we can do. We cannot be retroactive in our understandings of law. We cannot go back and say that something which was accepted as being legally binding is not, because of what we view today as being right or wrong, even if it is very painful to say that. So these two interpretive tools, the idea of contemporaneity and the idea of intertemporal law, means that we still would see the ICJ upholding a historical agreement as a treaty, so as being ranked very high as a source, because it was considered to be valid at the time. And so we always have to look at the law that's valid at the time and make sure that it is being applied in the context of historical evolution of claims, etc. That's a great question. Thank you, Ahmed.
I see Albert, you're actually the next question. You raised your hand, so go for it, Albert.
Albert, good to see you.
All right, good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, great. So we have a youth group here in Ghana where we usually host youth empowerment programs. And I believe that it is high time that our people here in West Africa also play their part in making sure that we contribute to the change that we want to see.
Mm-hmm.
And so for this, we are going to be hosting the National Youth SDG Summit here in Ghana between the month of June and July.
Excellent.
Yes, so I wanted to find out how best we can have a partnership between CYMG and UNEP, and then also give a speaking slot as well to have you on board for this initiative. Thank you.
Oh, wow.
Wow, that's amazing.
It is. It's incredible. And absolutely. Whatever you need, whatever I can do, please tell me, but shell it. Yes.
I will give my email. You might have seen it in the past, but send me an email and I'll connect you with the right people as well. Or you can send me a WhatsApp. I can certainly, we have a very, actually, I think our largest membership group is Africa. So we could absolutely help out with that. But I know you also had a question. Oh yeah, okay, that's the question. So I guess going back to what conferences or agreements should I learn for biodiversity action plan? If I attend BRS as an observer, what can I learn or what can I do? And I know Win and Ya, you are both from Myanmar, so I hope your families are doing better.
Absolutely. No, and definitely. And that is the first priority. Making sure that you are all well, and then making sure that your families are as well as can be. Definitely, absolutely. Now, in terms of BRS, if you attend as an observer, you can join me. I will also be there as an observer. And I will happily just find me or message me. I will happily get you a coffee and show you where the best places are for coffee, because might not necessarily be in the conference venue. But in all seriousness, the agenda for BRS is very interesting in its own context, and also because of the plastics treaty negotiations, because there will be, for example, the discussion of an amendment. It is a relatively small amendment in the sense that it's a timing amendment, but it still will allow you to see kind of how these are handled. We also got a sense, so last time we had a BRS COP, they're every 2 years. So it was 2023. Was right before the Paris negotiations for INC 2. And there were many issues, especially surrounding rules of procedure and voting, etc., that were raised in the context of BRS, because Stockholm has a settled set of rules of procedure. Basel and Rotterdam both have rules of procedure that still have brackets, so meaning there isn't an agreement, around the voting part of the text, and this came up as a discussion point and was very contentious, and that then spilled over into the plastics treaty as well. So there are often times where we'll see one issue come up in BRS and then see it come up in other COPs. You also obviously will have the ability to make contacts, to meet people. Unlike the UNFCCC COPs, which it's thousands, tens of thousands of people. I think it was almost 50,000 last year. And a big event space with public events and kind of blue zone, so requiring credential events. This is much smaller. BRS is much smaller. It's probably several thousand people at most. There is a small event space. There are several side events that take place every day, but not that many. There are some exhibits and some people who are there with their own booths, but again, very few. The space is much smaller and it is a bit more restricted access, but it does mean that you get to meet a lot of people who are centrally involved in innovation for trying to come up with new solutions for waste management, for example, but also who are involved directly in the negotiations. So that gives you that. Again, because as an observer, you don't have the ability to speak right away. You could make an opening statement or a statement during plenary, for example, which is held together. So the opening plenary for both Basel and, well, for all three, for Rotterdam, Basel, and Stockholm, is held at the same time, as is the closing. So you could do things like that.
And that is your next negotiations, isn't it?
It is. It is. I have been in the same spot for like 2 months now. So my next trip is to go to Geneva, which is like a third home for me at this point. So, I'm there so often. Love it so much. But seriously, if anyone is going to BRS, please send me a message. And I'm happy to meet up, to chat, to direct you to the better source of coffee, all of these things. And Shellen, just look at it as additional fact finding for when we go to INC.
Exactly. I was reminded yesterday that there is 4 months until INC, which is scary and exciting at the same time. I must admit, I am kind of excited to get back into negotiations and see all my friends. But there's a lot to do.
Oh yeah, but
I need to get a job
it does
too.
become this group of people. Yeah, it becomes the same group of people, and you all know each other, and then most of us stay on for cops, and then it just becomes a thing.
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, we don't have any more questions, but anybody else have a question or discussion? Alex and I really can talk all day long.
Well, we can, and we often do.
We
text
do.
each other all the time. Yes.
The biggest trend recently has been memes.
Oh, memes. Oh, so many penguins. So many penguins. Anyway.
The current youth coordination group for CYMG is very much into penguins. I will preface this. It's made with AI. I don't condone AI. But I do think it can be a tool to use. As someone who has ADHD, AI has been a great way for me to get my thoughts on paper. Yes, I can share a penguin meme.
Yes.
I will share one that might not get people upset from the INC Secretariat if they're watching, because they very much know about this boot camp. Let's see if there's one I can share. Anybody else have any thoughts while I find a penguin meme to share?
I'm quiet at this hour. I think largely evening. I'm looking at where many of you are coming from, and it tends to be evening. So, it is perfectly fine to just be tired at this point on on a Sunday evening. And yes, Eddie, there is a Minamata film. It actually debuted, or one of its debut points was at the Minamata COP, so at the end of 2023. If you've not seen it, it is extremely powerful. I mean, it is not an easy watch necessarily, but it is extremely powerful. And it does kind of, it reminds us of why we do these things. And I think it's important that we think about how does this work for other things like plastics in terms of producing media information that shows and highlights the importance of having regulation and the issues and the problems, etc.
Okay, here's one, and this actually happened. The meme I'm about to share. India, I can say this publicly because it did happen in the plenary. India asked to go back to INC2, and everyone was kind of like, "Oh no."
I remember that.
Here, rules of procedure. Let's move to action. Inc. I think we need to reflect on the preambular text from INC2.
I've even shown these to people in my household who wanted me to commend you on your use of this technology. I apologize. There's a thing in Quebec where in April, you are finally allowed to use your motorcycles. So this is an interesting fact. That's why if you heard weird noise in the background, that's what it was. From October to April, you are not allowed in Quebec to use your motorcycles because of concerns with snow and ice, etc. So it is April. It is a beautiful day here in Montreal. Welcome to Montreal, scenic as it is, because you can't see it in the background. But when it becomes April and it's a nice day, everyone goes out on the motorcycles, and so we get to hear them going through the city. So if you heard a weird noise, that's what it is. Randomly not constructions, for once. Anyway.
Here's another one.
Yes, the penguins.
Yes.
I've had the urge to go watch Happy Feet again. Anyway,
the penguin started with McDonald Island. That's how the penguins began when my country's president put tariffs on McDonald Island. So that's how the penguins all began. And it has evolved quite rapidly.
It has. I mean, it is involved like mini feature films, like the one I sent you.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Any other questions, comments, discussions?
Before we devolve to AI penguin. Oh yes, Ahmed, we will absolutely stay in touch. Yeah.
I know Slack. I know that there's been an increasingly big discussion about WhatsApp. The thing is, at the moment, the Children Major Youth Group mainly uses WhatsApp. There is definitely some, I think this is a wider discussion we're trying to have at the moment about, looking at alternatives. So maybe we could set up a Slack, potentially.
I defer to you on all choices.
We'll decide that.
Yeah.
We'll decide that. I don't think, there's much objection. We just have to make sure it's okay. So, but yeah, we'll let you know in the next few days. I know there was also discussion or question about having access to the slides. For now, because Alex is also wonderful hard work, everything will be up on YouTube, and that's how you can access the slides.
Okay. And again, if any questions come up, if you're looking at the slides and the recordings later on because you need a nap, for example, and I'm about to put you to sleep, and you want to ask a question before you doze off, please do feel free to ask, right? So it is about to end as our boot camp, which is heartbreaking in so many ways.
Certainly not plastics, though. We're just
oh no, and it's certainly not the end. Like, this was intended to be an informative source and also the beginning of a network and connection. So obviously we want to stay in touch with all of you. So please do.
Hold on. I think you have a question, then I can answer that afterwards.
Yes, I leave that to you. Yeah.
Hi, can I ask a question?
Of course.
Okay, can I ask like how do international environmental agreements use economic incentives like carbon trading or financial aid to encourage compliance? And are these mechanisms effective?
Excellent question. Such an excellent question. Sheldon, do you want to add anything before I get into it?
No, it's a very relevant
Okay.
question, and they don't teach you this in public policy school either.
No, they really don't. No. So the carbon market was, it was authorized under Kyoto and it's kind of continued on as an allowed model. So in itself, it's kind of intended to encourage compliance because it is the allowed and acceptable model that was agreed upon by every country at a certain point that signed on to Kyoto, as well as by those who are members of the WTO, et cetera. So in itself, using that model kind of encourages compliance with a number of different treaties. Whether the market system is the appropriate methodology for regulating is a different, I think, discussion. But then also there is the question of what do we do with capacity building? What do we do with financial mechanisms, et cetera? And so typically when we think about especially financing, the financial mechanisms will be created as they're being debated now for plastics, but they certainly exist for a number of other entities in a way that they are intended to link to national reporting, national action plans, but then also for compliance, if you're looking at especially those that are part of the Global Environment Facility or the World Bank, but really typically the Global Environment Facility, they have to follow the rules of the GEF as well. And so following the rules of the GEF means things like being accountable, having oversight, having more frequent reporting requirements than those that countries have to do for the various treaty regimes, following different protocols, different requirements and policies that are there. So, for example, following gender policies, following Indigenous community involvement policies, et cetera. So in that way, the use of financial mechanisms can be seen to have a certain element of compliance in it. And I'm glad you brought this up. We'll talk about this a bit more next week. Which scarily is tomorrow. And anyway, next week starts tomorrow. It's terrifying. But in our class on Tuesday and then on Thursday. But the financial mechanism debate in the context of the plastics treaty is whether we have something that is freestanding, so something like the Montreal Protocol, where it's self-governing, and it is under the conference of the parties. There would presumably be an established secretariat, an oversight body within it, but it is a separate entity, versus whether there would be a fund that would be created and implemented by the Global Environment Facility. And this is a really divisive area of tension. So we have the GRULAC, so the Latin American and Caribbean states, the African group of negotiators, and many of the Pacific Island states very strongly advocating for a standalone entity. There also is a really strong feeling from the European Union, from the WIGOs, the Western Europe and other group, and the Nordic funders, that this should actually be something where it's within the Global Environment Facility for reasons that include the question of compliance and oversight. So it's a really great question. It's a really important thing to look at. And as we start to look at more text, it's important to see where these areas come up.
And I think it's also worth noting, so something that's been happening in the past few weeks since we've been doing the boot camp is that Norway actually decided to have informal meetings.
Yeah.
So there were 2 informal meetings. The first one was kind of with all the kind of representatives from like the sides that don't agree. And then the second meeting was more about which is now called HAC Plus, or High Ambition Coalition and Friends, or the Coalition of the Willing. about kind of the three main articles of contention, which includes the financial mechanism. So it's also worth noting that there's work that's very much being done behind the scenes on this, literally probably as we speak, depending on the time zone we're in. And that is still kind of the big contention. I won't try to spill anything quite soon, but there is discussion among youth about introducing something at INC 5.2.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, that's kind of also what I think there's really, the treaties come down to three big articles of three big like gaps or contentions. Chemicals of concern, financial mechanisms, and whether to have reduction caps or not. Which are articles.
Yes. So it really comes down to like if you're looking at what was in the compilation document, it would be considered to be part 2.
Mm-hmm.
And then how those have carried over, and then also the financial mechanism elements. Definitely. You know, and I would just also kind of be on the lookout or pay attention to potential proposals as well to have this decided at a later, at one of the COPs, so at a later time, which may be a compromise. The concern there obviously is that could take years to operationalize. It could take years to get agreement on at a COP. And also, even if there is agreement to say that it will go through the Global Environment Facility, which is already established, it still will likely take several years. So we're not talking about financing that will be immediately available. We'll still need a bit of time. And we, first of all, obviously have to have it become fully effective. There are some recent examples. I just want to mention this again because I think it's really important. There are some recent examples where various types of funding were created within the Global Environment Facility to assist some countries in ratifying the BBNJ, the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement. So that can, in some rare instances, happen before the agreement actually enters into force, but it's really for the specific purpose of helping with ratification. And they're small, they're very kind of lower level funding opportunities. But for anything that would be really important for the plastics context in terms of implementing the treaty, we would have to typically wait until it becomes operational.
I see we have a hand raised.
Yes.
I have another. Hi, hello. I have another question.
Yeah. Go ahead.
My questions would be like, after major earthquakes, reconstruction often like prioritize speed over sustainability. So how can environmental economics guide post-earthquake recovery to ensure that it supports long-term environmental and economic resilience?
It is such an excellent question, and it's such a deep question. I wish I were an environmental economist to have a really good, like, technical answer for you. But I think, again, here's where we see the importance of funding and financing from many different sources, in many different contexts relating to disaster relief and also relating to various environmental challenges that may be faced during it, as well as human rights challenges and humanitarian challenges. In this context, that's where we see the importance of kind of working together with international funders, governments as well, private funders, and the local communities to see what is more helpful in the long run. And I think if we're thinking about a comparison with post-COVID, many of those decisions were made at the national level. They were not made with as much foreign funding or outside funding. They were made at the national level in terms of economic policy. This would be something where, if we're looking to see what can be done in terms of financing from outside, then there will be a lot of different discussions about sustainability and about the viability of whatever projects are being done or measures are being undertaken. But it's a really important question, and it's one that does vary depending on the funder as well and what the funder's requirements are. So it's very important when we think about making sure funding is available to understand that.
Excellent. So before we get on to the next question, there is another question about will there be another boot camp? And that is a discussion I must say we're having ongoing. There has been talk about it, potentially having one in the fall, but nothing
We're
has.
losing you a wee bit, Chellen.
Oh, is this better? Hold on. Is this better?
Yeah, we lost you. Of course, it's like the critical moment and it goes down. It just happens all the time.
There has been a discussion about it. There's still, I feel like, a lot to happen between now and fall. And we'll probably have more information in the coming months about whether we'll do another one. But there has been positive discussions about it. Next question. I know Makwa, I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. You have raised your hand. We also asked it in the chat, so feel free to ask if you want.
Okay, thank you so much. I had posted the question in the chat box because the last time I wanted to ask a question and then the time of the bootcamp
Oh
ended.
no.
So yeah, so just the questions that I developed since this bootcamp started, that how can various stakeholders, including local communities, non-governmental organizations, and the private sector, be effectively engaged in the negotiations and implementation processes of the multilateral environmental agreements? And then what metrics or indicators are commonly used to evaluate the success of multilateral environmental agreements? And how can countries ensure accountability in meeting whatever commitment they made at global level or regional level? Thank you.
These are such amazing questions. Thank you so much, really. So I think to get to the first question about stakeholders, the effectiveness really does depend on kind of what the willingness of the secretariat and the organizational structure is for involving various stakeholders. Now, what we've seen, for example, in the INC process, and what we see in many of the other MEA processes, so like especially UNFCCC and CBD, is a requirement. Certainly, the UNEA resolution creating the INC process had a specific reference to stakeholders and observers. Many others, COPs do as well. So that's where the allowance comes in and the presence comes in, the place comes in. Effectiveness is still something that is a question. So realistically, it is a state-driven process, as we often hear in the negotiations, in the sense that at the end of the day, the decision makers are the states. And sometimes this leads to times when we will be excluded. So outsiders from the state perspective, so observers, stakeholders, et cetera, will not be allowed into certain types of negotiation sessions, which is for many somewhat problematic, but it has happened that way. So in terms of effective participation, I think it's important to remember other avenues as well. So things like side events and participation in side events, official or otherwise, that may be taking place. Also things like participation in webinars, participation in online events leading up to any negotiation process. And then releasing things. I know it might not seem as kind of satisfactory or as involved as speaking, etc., but releasing documents, releasing information that says what your organization's point of view is or your community's point of view is, explaining, for example, the problems that your community may face or your organization may face because of plastics or other pollution, other environmental issues, can be very powerful. And releasing this kind of at a good time, so far enough in advance for countries to read it and potentially incorporate it into their discussions, but then close enough so they don't forget about it. can be really important. And so certainly from an organizational perspective, this is something that that when I'm working with IUCN, this is what we do quite frequently, is we put out policy briefs and policy papers that can be used as information, and they can provide background for the negotiators and other stakeholders as well. And that typically is the way that you can be effectively engaged, also physically to be present, if possible, to talk to people, to raise concerns, to have dialogue with delegates, to have dialogue with other stakeholders and build networks, etc. That can also be really important for effectiveness. In terms of, I have this whole list here in front of me, so this is a lovely cheat sheet. In terms of indicators, there aren't indicators for civil society participation as much. There are indicators for MEAs in the sense that there will often be a stock take or a review of national reports and national action plans that come in that have to be filed depending on the treaty regime. When that happens, then there tends to be an overview of where things are perhaps more challenging at the global level for implementation versus where things are perhaps doing well. And that tends to be the type of indicator that we would see coming out from the Secretariat, and then the Conference of the Parties would have the ability to adopt it or not, depending on what they think. And country accountability is an excellent question. Theoretically, it is possible in most treaty regimes that have a compliance requirement, a compliance committee or other oversight body, for a state to actually bring itself in front of the compliance committee. So ask whether or not in its national reporting or its NDC or its national biodiversity report system under CBD, whether it's actually in compliance or not. Now, does this happen very often? No. As you may imagine, states do not necessarily eagerly run to the idea of having a compliance committee oversee their activities and issue a statement about them. And it typically is one state questioning another, but it can happen. So that is one way to work on that. But obviously, if you have more questions on compliance, please share them. I'm really happy to answer them, because it's a very critical topic, because we can have a wonderful treaty. We can create something that's legally beautiful and makes a great deal of sense and seems like it will do a lot. But if it doesn't get enforced and if there isn't an appropriate compliance mechanism, what does it do at the end of the day?
Esther, you are next.
Yes, Esther, hi.
Hello, thank you so much for the discussions. Just wondering,
Mhm.
is it possible for a country to agree in secrecy, I think? Because I'm from Uganda, and I believe most of our countries are heavily funded by the Western world. I think there are times where we want to agree to these treaties because they are beneficial, but because of the strings attached in terms of funds and aid, it becomes really hard. So I'm just wondering, is it possible for a country to agree but not publicly?
It is certainly possible in a negotiation for a country to have kind of closed door discussions or backdoor discussions with other countries. But it is not, as a matter of law, to be bound by a treaty. It has to be done publicly, in the sense that a state has to sign it and then ratify it through whatever the process is at home. And that once the ratification is completed, that then actually gets filed with a dedicated UN office in New York City. And that then goes into the record publicly. Certainly there can be a private understanding amongst government members that they want to implement certain aspects, or they want to try to do legislative steps, even if they can't get through the whole treaty itself. But we do have to have a public declaration. And now we have sirens. I'm sorry. This is like Montreal Noise Day. We do have to have a public declaration by a state that it wishes to be bound by the terms of a treaty. So that is the one complication with that type of arrangement. Again, in a negotiation, it is entirely possible to have a strategy where perhaps countries are supportive but not publicly supportive. But they make it known that they would vote for something or they wouldn't vote against something in private. That would typically be the way it would work.
Interesting. You made me go look up, see if Uganda was in the high ambition coalition. And obviously I know a lot of the countries that are off the top of my head, but yeah, Uganda's not there. Interesting.
No.
Okay, I see Leonard asked a question, and I think is it the Bureau or the BRS and its role in
The Bureau.
In the Bureau? What is the Bureau and the role in the treaty negotiations, which is another excellent
I believe
question.
yes. So the Bureau is, I'm so glad you asked, Leonard. It's a very kind of nebulous term in many people's eyes, but it's a really critical role. So the Bureau is typically it's consisting of the chair of the INC process in this case, and then representatives who are elected by, well, nominated by and agreed to by their respective geographic areas, and then they are fully confirmed and voted in, or at least there's an announcement of their name and no one says no, and if they do, then there's a vote from the different geographic regions. So it's typically one person per region. One of those people will serve as an official rapporteur, so they will take notes and then they will issue the formal both draft at the end of the negotiation session and also at the beginning of the new negotiation, the report from the previous negotiations saying what happened during the INC meetings. And in addition to that, they have a great deal of connection with the Secretariat. So they're able to work on substantive questions that come up, things like how does the agenda get approved? What is the order of the agenda? When are meetings going to be held? Various logistical details around the meetings, various questions that come up in terms of information documents and looking at information documents, etc. So they do hold a great deal of power in terms of actually figuring out what will happen during many aspects of the negotiation and how they'll be structured at least, and especially what the agenda looks like. So they do have a great deal of authority in that way. It is a much more kind of quiet role than the Secretariat, which often gets a great deal of attention. The chair certainly gets a great deal of attention, but the other members not as much. And yet they really do play an important role throughout the negotiation process. They also tend to be the same people each time, unless someone, for example, say switches roles in their government, and so they're no longer representing a country, or retires or something like that. And at that point, they are filled. But otherwise, they tend to be the same people. So when we do have a shift, for example, from one chair to another, as we did in the plastic sciencey process, you have at least some people who are still the same and have like an institutional memory of the discussions. So that is the Bureau in a nutshell.
Excellent. And there's a follow-up question about what are the implementation, monitoring, and supportive mechanisms the various secretariats employ to ensure actual implementation beyond the preparation of policy documents?
So they are rather limited in the sense that the Secretariat doesn't have a monitoring role. There are typically monitoring bodies that are put in place once the treaty goes into effect to address monitoring, implementation, etc. So the Secretariat does not serve that function. They facilitate discussion, they facilitate the exchange of documents, they create documents that are approved and then released, etc., but they don't have that role. Once the INC, for example, starts, and once there is an agenda that was formally agreed by the Secretariat and the Bureau and then adopted by the INC, the Secretariat's role is very much there to provide information, to provide logistical support, to tell us really vitally what time the cafeteria is open, where to go for food, where to go for coffee, what our schedule will be for the day, what rooms we're going to meet in, also to release new documents. So, for example, during INC 5, there were two iterations of chairs non-papers that came out. The Secretariat released them. So to make sure that those are all released, to update the schedule and share scheduling changes. And then if there are and this is obviously a very critical role, if we are at a stage in a negotiation, or obviously we now are, where we have text being proposed or alternatives or substitutes being proposed to text, what we typically have is someone working quite hard, and I think we can never properly thank them enough from the Secretariat to be a reporter, a rapporteur, to take notes and to typically, under a great deal of pressure and scrutiny, sit there and publicly type so it appears on a very big computer screen all the suggestions in. And those can take a great deal of time, and sometimes they're not as clear. And sometimes it's a very tense situation in the room. So the Secretariat provides that type of support as well. So they really are kind of the unsung heroes in many ways of getting us through the INC process, and keeping us fed and caffeinated.
Yes, the important questions. Yes. The important questions we have, especially when we're into day 5 or 6 and just exhausted.
It's generally at that point, it's schedule, coffee, more coffee, schedule, maybe some food. Yeah.
Yeah.
New documents. That's the mindset. Yeah.
Okay, next question. I think this is another fantastic question, and this has also been maybe an issue, but not, yeah, it's been an issue. I don't want to admit it, but it has. Do young people have decision-making roles in the Secretariat's mechanisms?
You want to take that, gentlemen?
We don't. It's
no. So it's the Secretariat, and then obviously the Bureau has state members representing geographic regions. But to be more dispassionate about it, perhaps, no, none of the major groups, none of the observers, etc., are involved in that. It is a separate entity that works on its own, and obviously we'll have meetings with a number of different constituencies, and we'll talk to people and try their best to accommodate. But no, it's the short answer.
I have a leadership role now, which I did not have previously. Maybe just to say that if there's anything I've learned in this since being involved in climate negotiations, it's that young people don't have as much of a role as they should. And it's very frustrating. Even I think my opinion won't change when I become a cheerleader of youth as well. I mean, the amount of lack of power that we have is shocking. So.
Oh, you still have a few more years until you're a cheerleader, my dear. You do.
But anyhow, ooh, I like all these questions. I should just stop saying that because they're all great questions. No, you're not being annoying asking a lot of questions at the end. No. Alex and I, in fact, just to share something personally, we had probably like a 2 or 3 hour conversation at like the consultation day of INC 5. Yes. And probably could have gone on for 5 more hours.
Oh, easily.
If we didn't have, we were overlooking a hotel in Busan, overlooking the ocean. So yeah, no, it's not annoying at all.
No.
The COP30 presidency of UNFCCC is trying to achieve significant progress through humanity by uniting the goals of UNFCCC, CBD, and UNCCD. I think in the future plastics will be included in that, though. From an international law perspective, what could be achieved from that goal of trying to be binding to all parties in 3 treaties?
It is, thank you. I mean, it's never a bother, please. Questions are great. It is an aspirational goal. From an international law perspective, again, and I think we talked about this last time, each treaty is its own legal obligation and its own set of legal obligations. The three treaties came out at the same time in the same year. They were informed by each other. They were informed by the Rio Declaration, etc. Which is why I think Brazil is so particularly invested in this as the COP host and COP presidency this year. And as the presidency of the UNFCCC COP, they can certainly encourage states and try to work with states to recognize the importance of CBD and CCD and try to incorporate biodiversity and desertification concerns into the COP decisions, etc. However, each instrument is a separate instrument. And because it's a separate instrument, we can't necessarily say that we're going to bind the states that are party to UNFCCC to all the terms of CBD or desertification and drought for several reasons. First of all, we may have states that are party to UNFCCC and not to the other treaties, so that creates a problem. Then we have the fact that they are each their own treaties with their own COPs and their own decision-making bodies. So one conference of the parties saying we want to adopt or push for kind of the mainstreaming of the goals of the other two treaties in our treaty is perfectly fine. But trying to then say, and we want the CBD and CCD to do the same is something that you can ask for, but you can't mandate because there are separate COPs for each treaty, and they would each have to make their own decisions about whether or not to do that and how they would want to do that. So I think it's an excellent goal. From a more customary international law perspective, I think it's an excellent goal. And it is important to remember that these three are all linked and they're all linked to the triple planetary crisis. Of course, obviously, we have evolved a great deal in terms of what other treaties exist. And so there are, as Sheldon pointed out, not only will there hopefully be a plastics treaty soon, but there will also be concerns that are addressed in BRS, in Minamata, in the Vienna Convention and Montreal Protocol relating to pollution that are not necessarily reflected in these three. So when we are looking at these three, it's important to remember the history that they were created at the same time in Rio. So by having the COP go back, UNFCCC COP go back to Brazil, I think that's where you're seeing a lot of this push coming from, the historical connection.
I think it's also worth noting that Brazil has been very much involved in plastics treaty, and in fact has been kind of leading some aspects, especially when it comes to trying to find consensus and what's the right word? Helping really trying to make progress as well. So I mean, even though we don't hear about it as much, they are certainly writing themselves into the history books of the plastics treaty.
Oh, definitely. And they're one of their chief negotiators, Mariana Helica, is actually quite active as a co-chair. She's wonderful, but she's quite active as a co-chair of one of the contact groups and has been really instrumental in trying to keep the group going and trying to keep momentum moving along, also with a great sense of humor and realism. So yes, definitely an important country in our negotiation process.
In fact, was one of the countries that was trying to save her country. Oh no, am I zoning out?
You're choppy.
Okay. In fact, she was actually, Brazil was one they were trying to save the intergovernmental, I can't think right now, the working groups between the intersessional period of INC3 and INC4.
Intersessionals,
the intersessionals, and they were in fact one of them that was very much vocal along with the United States at the time of trying to save and have intersessionals. Unfortunately, it did not pass, but their stance might not always be ambitious, but they're very much a team player when it comes to trying to get things done.
and ambitious to have a treaty.
Yes. Oh, yes. I don't see any more questions, but I do want to maybe try to end up something with positive. We haven't talked so much. We've had some success in IMO.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what happened?
Oh no, you brought it up. You talk about it. It's you. Look at you. You're like glowing. Look at this.
I was so excited. I just needed some positive news in my life. Some positive news for the planet. And maybe you could fill in the gaps. Countries
Yeah.
agreed to, it's a minor treaty, right? It's a treaty or it's
Yeah.
amendment. And they approved basically to address GHG emissions, which they'll adopt the finalized framework in October 2025, and it will enter into force. And it's actually the first ever global mandatory emissions limits in GHG pricing across an entire shipping, maritime shipping industry sector. So multilateralism does work.
It does work. It does work. Now, I should point out the rules of procedure are slightly different in the IMO, a number of different things. But yes, it does work. It absolutely does work. And, there is still a way to think about how we move an environmental agenda forward, even in contexts that are not necessarily on their face always environmentally oriented. Which is, I think, also important because we have heard a number of people express concerns about multilateralism and the ability to move forward in certainly in the INC process and some of the other COPs as well. So I think it's important to remember that these are cross-cutting issues, and when we're looking for positivity and we're looking for kind of areas of growth, we don't only look at the MEAs, we also look outside and we look at the other applicable treaties that might be there. And I see that there is a question from Leonard. Let's see, is it accurate to say that conventions are policy frameworks while treaties are laws? No, conventions are also treaties. They are also considered to be treaties. So the UN Convention on the Law of the Child is a treaty. The UN Convention Against Torture is a treaty. These are just the ones that come to mind off the top of my head, but there obviously are many more. So UN Framework Convention on Climate Change creates a framework, but it is itself a legally binding instrument as a convention.
Yeah. So I know we're a little bit, but if there's any final questions, thoughts, ideas, as we said, we're entering the final week, sadly, but certainly not the end of the plastics treaty journey. More like the beginning to INC 5.2, the end of the beginning, I guess you could say.
Yes. And and I think you and I, Shelley, will have some conversations about what we do before 5.2 and how we keep the momentum going and how we,
definitely
move the network of people who we're creating.
Yeah. And I think
yeah.
There's also been a discussion that we recognize that being involved in these negotiations is a privilege.
Absolutely.
And it gives me goosebumps saying it every time, that we represent a lot more people that unfortunately cannot be there due to various reasons. It would be amazing if everybody could be there, like the amount of presence that we could have to show member states. But kind of the philosophy of youth, and I think, Alex, you share this philosophy as well, is how do we make sure we get as many people involved as possible, whether it's online, opinions, we have the consultations coming up, but really that it's a collective action.
No, absolutely. It is critical, that we all have a voice. It's critical that those of us who have a physical presence in a room, acknowledge the privilege that it is, and that we know that we have so many other people, we carry so many other people and voices with us, which is, I think, also important for those of us who can get frustrated at times by the progress or lack thereof, because being in that room, having a role in this space is an honor, and for many of us it may be the high point of our careers. So it's a very special thing, and we want as many of you as possible to be able to give us your opinions, give us your voices, let us hear from you, and then move forward.
And I will just put this out there. If anybody can self-fund themselves. I will be saying self-fund. Reach out to me if you want to come to INC 5.2. As I said, we cannot offer funding at this time, but we could potentially help you get accreditation and get involved. But that's, as I said, only self-funding. We could always use more manpower on the youth front with these negotiations as well. So, but yeah, only if you can unfortunately self-fund at this time.
And if anyone will be at BRS too, please let me know.
Yes. All right. Have a great rest of your evenings, mornings, afternoons.
We'll see you soon.
We'll see you on Tuesday. It's not
On
over yet.
Tuesday, which for some of you is, only a day away. So anyway, take care. Let's see. Leonard, just text me your questions. Text me all your questions. I know you have more. So text me or email me and we'll go from there.
All
Can
right.
I say
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Take care.